I spent the better part of 2 months trying to answer what seemed like a simple question. Why did the monsoon season affect Australian and American forces so differently in Vietnam? The more I read, the after-action reports from one ATF headquarters at Nui Dat, the declassified operational analyses from the Australian War Memorial, the veteran oral histories, the more I realized I wasn't looking at a weather story at all. I was looking at a doctrine story, a philosophy of war story. The rain was just the thing that made the difference visible. What I found when I finally understood that stopped me cold. Because the gap between what these two allied armies could do in the wet season wasn't just a tactical detail. It was a window into why one approach to this war worked and one didn't. And the Australians knew it from the moment they arrived. August 18th, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The monsoon had been falling for days. Not the kind of rain that clears the air and cools the skin. This was a wall of water, warm and relentless, hammering the rubber plantation canopy until the sound swallowed everything else. Radio chatter, footsteps, whispered orders. The red laterite soil of Long Tan had turned to ankle-deep mud. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was out in it anyway. 108 men, patrolling through conditions that would have halted operations for any force that hadn't specifically trained for exactly this. What no one in D Company knew, yet, was that somewhere in that flooded rubber plantation, an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Viet Cong were waiting. I've read every account I could find of what happened next. I've gone through the after-action reports, the veteran testimonies, the later historian analyses. And here is what kept striking me, over and over, as I worked through the material. The Australians were not out there because they had been sent into an ambush. They were out there because, in the Australian doctrinal world, there was no such thing as a day too wet to patrol. The monsoon wasn't a pause in the war. It was part of the war. That belief, that philosophy, drilled into every Australian soldier through years of experience across Malaya, Borneo, and New Guinea, is what this story is really about. Because while D Company was wading through the mud of Long Tan, large-scale American search and destroy operations were grinding down across the country, throttled by rain that grounded helicopters, jammed mechanized columns, and turned the vast logistical machinery of the U.S. Army into a liability rather than an asset. The Americans didn't stop fighting in the monsoon, but they stopped operating the way they fought, which amounted to something very similar. The gap between the two Allied approaches was never more visible than when the sky opened up and the rain came down. What I found when I kept pulling on this thread will surprise you. Because the Australians didn't figure this out in Vietnam. They figured it out 20 years earlier, in the jungles of a different war, in a different country. And the Americans, for all their firepower and resources, had never learned the same lesson. When American military commanders looked at the Vietnam conflict in the early 1960s, they looked at it through the lens of what they knew. Big unit operations, massive firepower, air mobility, and logistical dominance. These were the things that had won the Second World War. These were the things that had stopped the Chinese in Korea. These were the things that made the United States Army the most powerful conventional fighting force on Earth. Weather was a factor to be managed, a variable to be accounted for in operational planning. The monsoon season, roughly May through October in the south, arriving earlier in the north, was understood as a constraint, a period during which helicopter availability dropped, road movement slowed, and large-scale offensive operations became significantly harder to sustain. You planned around it. You pushed major operations into the dry season when your assets worked properly, and you did what you could when they didn't. Reading through the operational planning documents from MACV in this period, I kept seeing the same underlying assumption surfacing again and again. The war would be won by firepower and mobility. If the weather degraded your firepower and mobility, you waited for better weather. It wasn't cowardice, it was logic. At least, it seemed like logic to an army built around combined arms, helicopter assault, and the aerial resupply chain that sustained everything. When I first came across what Dean Rusk, the U.S. Secretary of State, told the ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962, I nearly put down what I was reading. He freely admitted, and this is documented, that United States armed forces knew very little about jungle warfare. The most powerful military in the world, on the eve of its deepest involvement in Southeast Asia, was acknowledging a fundamental gap in its knowledge and experience. That admission wasn't just diplomatic candor. It was an accurate assessment. The U.S. military had fought in Pacific jungles during the Second World War, but what it took from that experience was primarily the value of air power and amphibious assault, not the patient, sodden, slow-moving art of jungle counterinsurgency. General William Westmoreland, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, was deeply uncomfortable with the Australian approach almost from the moment first Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966. He reportedly complained to Australian commanders that one ATF was not being aggressive enough. He was watching the Australians spend days on a single kilometer of jungle, moving forward a few steps at a time, stopping, listening, moving again, refusing to use the main tracks, refusing to call in airstrikes that would announce their position, refusing to do anything that the U.S. Army's doctrine would have recognized as decisive action. It looked, from the American perspective, like the Australians were barely fighting. In the dry season, that impression was hard enough to shake. When the monsoon came, and the American operational tempo dropped visibly while the Australians just kept patrolling, the friction between the two approaches became impossible to ignore. I spent weeks trying to verify something one American officer is quoted as saying during a joint operations discussion in 1967, to the effect that it was pointless trying to sustain patrol schedules in monsoon conditions because the mud alone would wear a man down to nothing. What I found instead was that Australian after-action reports from the same period described uninterrupted patrol schedules. Same mud, different conclusion. The difference wasn't physical. It wasn't that Australian soldiers were harder or tougher. It was that they had been specifically trained and doctrinally prepared to regard the monsoon not as an obstacle, but as a tactical environment, one they understood, and their enemy did not expect them to operate in. That understanding came from somewhere very specific. The story starts not in Vietnam, but in Burma, in 1943 and 1944. And it starts with a lesson that nearly everyone else forgot. In the early years of the Pacific War, both the Allied and Japanese forces in Burma operated on the same basic assumption about the monsoon. When the rains came, you stopped. Major offensive operations ground to a halt. Supply lines became nightmares. Troops sheltered and waited. The monsoon season was, by unspoken agreement, a pause in the war. General William Slim changed that. Commanding what became the 14th Army in the Burma campaign, Slim made a deliberate doctrinal decision that Commonwealth troops would no longer pause for monsoon. They would be trained, equipped, and mentally prepared to fight through it. The implications of that decision were enormous. The Japanese and the earlier Allied forces, who were used to weather-enforced respite, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who didn't stop. The psychological and tactical advantages of that shift were dramatic. I found the key line buried in a history of jungle warfare doctrine. Previously, both sides had stopped operations in the monsoon season, but Commonwealth troops were now expected to move and fight during the wet season. That shift in doctrine carried forward through Malaya, through Borneo, and eventually directly into Vietnam. When Australian forces deployed to the Malayan Emergency in the early 1950s, They entered a jungle counterinsurgency campaign, where the wet season was simply another operating condition. The Commonwealth Jungle Warfare School at Kota Tinggi in Malaya codified this. Soldiers weren't taught to tolerate the rain, they were taught to use it. Rain reduced visibility for the enemy just as much as for the patrol. Rain masked movement sounds. Rain disrupted the enemy's food supply operations and degraded his logistical capacity to reach his own jungle sanctuaries. The monsoon, understood properly, was a weapon. Australian doctrine, codified formally in 1965 in the Division in Battle series, was almost entirely shaped by the Malayan experience. The foundational text that guided one ATF operations, known by the acronym ATOM, the Australian Troops Operating Manual, specified that patrolling was continuous, year-round, and that weather conditions were never a basis for curtailing the tempo of operations. This was not rhetoric. It was a training reality. Battalions cycling through Vietnam had spent years in North Queensland, in Papua New Guinea, in Malaysia, learning to patrol in the wet. By the time an Australian soldier put boots in the mud of Phuoc Tuy, operating in monsoon conditions was simply what operating looked like. The contrast with U.S. preparation is stark in the documentary record. When one RAR served alongside the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade in Viet Cong Province before one ATF was established, the differences in approach were already visible. The Americans operated in large formations, moved noisily, and relied on firepower to create contact with the enemy. At night, the Australian position was easy to identify. It was the part of the perimeter without illumination, because the Australians were doctrinally trained to operate in darkness and without visible signatures that would compromise position. Historian Albert Palazzo, in his analysis of Australian operations, describes the friction between the two doctrines as almost constant. The Americans were bold, noisy, and spoiling for a fight, while the Australians preferred a quieter, stealthy approach. What that meant in operational terms was that the U.S. approach was heavily dependent on the assets that the monsoon degraded most: helicopter mobility, air support, road-based mechanized movement. The Australians were dependent on the one thing monsoon rain didn't touch: a trained infantryman's ability to move slowly and silently through wet jungle. When the sky opened up over Phuoc Tuy each wet season, the Americans lost a significant portion of their force multipliers. The Australians lost almost none of theirs. The Viet Cong noticed. What I kept finding in the interrogation records and captured documents was a consistent picture of enemy forces using the monsoon season to move, resupply, and regroup. Assuming, as the VC had learned from experience against ARVN and U.S. forces, that heavy operations would slow or pause. In Phuoc Tuy Province, that assumption ran directly into one ATF, and the consequences would prove catastrophic for the VC. August 18, 1966. I keep coming back to this date. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men. The company had been sent out from Nui Dat base to investigate mortar positions following an enemy attack the previous night. The morning was already thick with monsoon rain when they moved into the Longtan rubber plantation. Visibility was down to 30 or 40 meters in some places. The wet season canopy turned the afternoon light into a gray murk. At approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, the lead platoon of D Company made contact with enemy forces. What the Australian patrol thought was a small group turned out to be the forward elements of a force estimated at between 1,500 and 2,000 troops. The 275th VC Regiment, reinforced by elements of D 445 Provincial Mobile Unit. D Company was outnumbered somewhere between 14 and 18 to 1. What I found when I read the after-action reports from that afternoon was that the Australians should not have survived. By any numerical calculus, they shouldn't have survived. The VC commanders must have known the ratio. They certainly pressed the attack with everything they had. What they hadn't calculated for was the volume and accuracy of artillery support that one ATF could deliver. Round after round of 105mm howitzer fire, called in through deteriorating radio conditions as D Company's ammunition ran critically low. And the fundamental fact that the monsoon that was masking D Company's communications and movement was hitting the Visa just as hard. Private Barry Magnuson of D Company later described being so deep in mud during the battle that movement between positions was measured in meters per minute. 18 Australians were killed, 24 were wounded. When relief forces broke through at nightfall, they found the rubber plantation littered with 245 confirmed Viet Cong dead. Blood trails and drag marks in the mud suggested the true casualty figure was considerably higher. The kill ratio, a metric the Americans used to measure progress, was something that no U.S. unit with comparable numbers could have matched. 108 men had held off 1,500. The Battle of Long Ton didn't happen in spite of the monsoon. It happened in it. And the Australians fought in it, not because they had no choice, but because their doctrine gave them no other option. You patrolled, you maintained pressure, you didn't stop for rain. The strategic implications took slightly longer to materialize, but were just as dramatic. Because what one ATF understood, what Westmoreland had been watching with baffled frustration and what the VC were about to discover, was that the monsoon was where the Australian approach was most effective. The VC relied on wet season operations to move food, ammunition, and reinforcements. They expected to do this largely undisturbed. In Phuoc Tuy, they could not. In May 1969, 6 RARNZ launched Operation Lavarack, an ambushing and reconnaissance in force operation that ran continuously for 32 days, from May 30th to July 1st, covering almost the entire transition into and through the early monsoon season. Over those 32 days, operating in conditions that ranged from sweltering heat to sustained torrential rain, the battalion defeated 2 main force regiments and a district company, captured and destroyed hundreds of enemy bunkers, and in the assessment of a senior military historian at the Australian War Memorial, irreparably damaged the military and political position of the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy Province. 32 days, continuous, through the monsoon. The unit's after-action report is one of the most detailed documents I worked through in researching this story. What struck me was the absence of any reference to weather as a limiting factor. It simply wasn't a consideration. The patrols went out. The ambushes were set. The enemy, who had moved into the area expecting the wet season to provide cover, found Australians waiting in the rain. An NVA prisoner from 33 NVA Regiment, captured during this period, told interrogators something that stopped me when I read it. Food was scarce, and supply of rice was difficult because of Australian activity. He described carriers being sent on 3-day marches, each way, just to find food, because the Australian patrol lines had disrupted every supply route. This was monsoon season. The VC had banked on moving freely. They couldn't. By 1967, one ATF had developed a systematic understanding of what the monsoon season actually meant in tactical terms. And the Australians had also done something that, reading through the intelligence records, I found genuinely remarkable. They had mapped the enemy's own seasonal rhythm in Phuoc Tuy and built their operations specifically to disrupt it. The VC in Phuoc Tuy operated a food supply system that depended on seasonal movement. During the wet season, food portering parties moved along jungle tracks to pre-position supplies for main force operations later in the year. The Australians understood this, and the Australian response was to target those supply lines with maximum intensity, precisely during the months when the enemy thought they were safest. The tactical instrument was the patrol ambush. Australian doctrine on ambush was refined through years of Malayan practice into something that bore almost no resemblance to the U.S. approach. An Australian patrol would spend days, sometimes up to 9 hours, covering a single mile, moving to an ambush position. They would set up with absolute noise and light discipline. They would wait in the rain, in the mud, for as long as it took. And they would select positions on exactly the trails that food portering parties needed to use. The data, when I finally found it, was striking. Analysis published by researchers at the Australian War Memorial, working from the patrol contact records that one ATF headquarters collected throughout the war, showed that one ATF were dramatically more effective at ambushing the enemy than the enemy were at ambushing them, despite fighting an enemy acknowledged as expert in ambush technique. What drove that effectiveness was consistent patrol pressure maintained through every season, combined with an intelligence picture that grew steadily more refined as the Australians developed informant networks and signals intelligence. The contrast with U.S. operations during the same period wasn't invisible to American commanders who worked alongside one ATF. The 2nd Battalion, 35th Field Artillery, the only American unit to serve as a regular integral component of a foreign combat force during the war, operated with one ATF from 1966 to 1971. Their own records from this period describe the unique adaptations required to support Australian operations in monsoon conditions. The battery's 155mm howitzers faced a specific technical problem. Monsoon rainfall was so heavy that it detonated variable-time fuse shells in mid-air as they hit sheets of falling water at supersonic speed. American gunners, drawing on experience from the high plains of Colorado, had never encountered anything remotely like it. The Australians worked with them on a solution, a simple cone fitted over the detonating trigger. But the episode illustrates something fundamental. The Americans, for all their resources, were learning the monsoon from scratch in theater. The Australians had already learned it in Malaya. The enemy adapted too. VC commanders in Phuoc Tuy, interrogation records show, tried different patterns. They timed food movement to avoid the periods of maximum Australian patrol density. They varied their approach routes. They dispersed caches across wider areas. But the Australian response was to track those adaptations through the intelligence network and adjust the patrol pattern accordingly. The ambush success data shows a consistent Australian edge maintained across every wet season of the war. The enemy couldn't find a weather window because the Australians weren't waiting for one. By 1969, the cumulative impact was measurable in the most basic way. Enemy food stocks in Phuoc Tuy were collapsing. The average quantity of food captured per bunker system and base camp, tracked systematically by one ATF intelligence, had declined each year since operations began. By mid-1969, the collapse in food supplies had stopped the movement of enemy main force units into the province. The VC's logistical system, built in part on the assumption that wet season would provide operational cover, had been dismantled patrol by patrol, ambush by ambush, through every monsoon since 1966. By 1969 and into 1970, one ATF's monsoon-capable operational tempo had achieved something that no amount of American firepower had managed in any U.S. operational area of comparable duration: effective pacification. The statistics I assembled from the operational records are unambiguous in their pattern. In 1966, Viet Cong forces in Phuoc Tuy Province were operationally dominant, controlling the countryside almost entirely outside the provincial capital of WWII and the major towns. Roads were impassable without heavy armed escort. VC tax collection and political organization reached into every village. The Australians arriving in that environment in June 1966, establishing themselves at Nui Dat in, it should be noted, torrential monsoon rain, inherited a province that was effectively enemy-held territory. By late 1969 and into 1970, following a sustained WWII campaign that had not slowed for a single wet season, the situation had reversed to a degree that was difficult to believe when I first read it. The bulk of PAVN and VC forces had become inactive and left the province to recuperate. Highway 15, the main route running through Phuoc Tuy between Saigon and Vung Tau, was open to unescorted traffic. The province had been largely cleared of the local VC infrastructure that had dominated it for years. What drove this? The analysis by Andrew Ross, Bob Hall, and Amy Griffin in their examination of WWII combat operations identifies the core mechanism clearly. WWII strategy targeted the enemy system of food supply. Patrols went against enemy lines of communication, bunker systems, and base camps where food reserves were concentrated. Over the course of the war, WWII units captured over 1,800 bunker systems and base camps. The average food per system declined each year to almost nothing by 1970. When the food supply collapsed, main force unit movement into the province stopped. And here is the point that I kept returning to as I assembled this picture. The food supply system was most vulnerable during the wet season, when VC logistics depended on movement along jungle tracks. The enemy couldn't move in the dry season without Australian patrols interdicting him. They couldn't move in the wet season either, for the same reason. There was no safe window. The Australians had closed both. The VC themselves provided the most eloquent testimony to what this felt like from the other side. A former VC commander, in a post-war assessment that has been widely quoted by historians, put it this way: worse than the Americans were the Australians. The American style was to hit us, then call for planes and artillery. Our response was to break contact and disappear if we could. The Australians were more patient than the Americans, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. They liked to stay with us instead of calling in the planes. We were more afraid of their style. I want to hold that quote up for a moment because of what it reveals about the monsoon problem. The American approach, hit, call for planes and artillery, depended on assets that rain degraded. Helicopters, air support, mechanized follow-up. When the monsoon came and those assets became unreliable, the U.S. approach lost much of its threat potential. The VC knew this. They planned around it. The Australian approach, patience, stealth, the long, slow patrol, the ambush set and waited on for days, was indifferent to weather in a way the American approach could never be. Rain didn't ground the Australian's primary weapon. His primary weapon was his own trained feet, his own disciplined silence, his own willingness to lie in the mud for as long as it took. The rain couldn't take that away. If anything, it helped. It masked sound. It degraded VC movement. It turned the jungle into a more confined and predictable operating environment, one where Australian intelligence about enemy movement patterns gave them a decisive edge. Westmoreland's complaint that the Australians were not being aggressive enough was, reading the numbers, entirely wrong. They were being aggressive every single day, including the days when the Americans had reduced their operational tempo to what the monsoon would allow. The Australian aggression was just quieter. And it worked. Phuoc Tuy Province, as WWII withdrew its last combat elements in 1971, was a different place from the VC-dominated territory the Australians had entered in that monsoon season deployment in June 1966. The military historian's verdict, delivered at a gathering of Vietnam veterans at the Australian War Memorial in 2009, described WWII's campaign there as having achieved the same military result in Phuoc Tuy as in Malaya and Borneo. Province pacified. Enemy logistics broken. Population progressively separated from VC control. It didn't win the war, Nothing happening in Phuoc Tuy could win a war that was being lost at the strategic and political level across the rest of the country. But in the territory that one ATF was responsible for, the Australian approach, year-round pressure, patient patrolling, monsoon-capable operations, achieved results that proved what the Doctrine had always claimed was possible. What this story taught me, more than anything else, is that the most decisive military advantages are often invisible until the environment changes. In perfect operating conditions, clear skies, dry roads, functional helicopter assets, the difference between the Australian and American approaches in Vietnam was a matter of style. When the monsoon came, it became a matter of capability. An army built for firepower and mobility loses much of what makes it effective when the rain grounds its helicopters and turns its roads to rivers. An army built for the patient, systematic pressure of jungle counterinsurgency loses almost nothing when the wet season arrives. That gap, invisible in the dry season, obvious in the wet, is what this whole story is about. And the Australians had understood it, formally and doctrinally, since the 14th Army in Burma decided in 1943 that Commonwealth troops would no longer stop fighting when the monsoon came. The VC in Phuoc Tuy learned the same lesson, the hard way, one rain-soaked ambush at a time. When I think of that figure, the VC food supply per captured bunker system declining every year, approaching zero by 1970. I think of it as the statistical ghost of every Australian patrol that went out in the wet when no one expected them to. Every ambush set in mud and rain. Every kilometer covered in 9 hours of careful, silent movement through a jungle that the rain was supposed to make impassable. It wasn't impassable. It never was. The Australians had known that since Malaya. It just took a very specific kind of army to prove it.